Ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this event convened by the Global Policy Institute and Bay Atlantic University in Washington, D.C. Today we're going to talk about international development, but from a completely new perspective, as we shall hear from our panelists. My name is Paolo from Schirach, and I serve as both the president of the Global Policy Institute and as chair of Political Science and International Relations at Bay Atlantic University. For those of you who are not familiar with us, we are located in downtown Washington, D.C., very close to the White House, really a few steps from Lafayette Park. Today, as I said, we have the pleasure of having with us experts and really practitioners, seasoned practitioners, in this new area of international development, which, as we will hear from them, is a blended finance. And what does it mean? What is the role of the private sector in development? What is it that is new and interesting? Does it have traction? Will it work? What are the success stories? We will hear quite a bit as we move along in this hour. So without further ado, you have all the bios of our three panelists, so I will not recite them for you. So in the interest of time, I welcome our panelists. And by the way, we've got one joining us from Nairobi in East Africa. Thank you. And Kristi and Noemi here from the Washington, D.C. area. Kristi, why don't I just start with you? You've been at it now for many, many years in different shapes and articulations. Tell us what's going on. What is new? What is blended finance? What is USAID Invest? It sounds almost, a contradiction in terms. USAID Invest? How do the two things work together? But you know that they do, and explain it to us. Thank you.
Thanks, Paolo, and thanks for inviting us to be on this panel. I think my first comment would be that it's not really new, but it has a new intensified focus. I've been working in development for way too long, decades and decades. And about the last almost 2 decades, I've been working as, they're called chiefs of party. It essentially means a project manager on projects that aim to push the envelope and push international development closer to the private sector. And so this has been happening really since 2000 is really when this started. And I think it started mainly because foreign assistance, development aid, ODA, whatever term you refer to it, has been declining. And the problems have been increasing. And if you just take one metric there, the Sustainable Development Goals put out by the United Nations, to implement that set of interconnected goals, they estimate will take anywhere from $2 to $4 trillion. And there's no way that public donors, governments, which are made up of the money of its taxpayers, are going to be able to put together packages of assistance at the level of $4 trillion. So that's really the driver and the kind of context for all of this. And international development has been bending toward private sector more and more and more. But what is blended finance? How does that fit into all of this? That's really the blending or the mixing of public sector resources, donor money, and private sector resources. Private sector is been around, it continues to make investments, it continues to drive an economy, but the public sector, the donors, the governments have increasingly seen that if they put a little bit of money in, they can actually catalyze larger volumes of money for investment. Now, why is this important? I'll give you an example of how a little bit of money And this is actually some work that Tunuka's firm, CrossBoundary, did for us very early on in this current project that I manage called Invest. And here the development goals were, let's have more jobs in Kenya. Let's have renewable energy and access to it even outside of the urban centers. Let's give more employment and training to women. And you might sit in your ivory tower or your building and say, how are we going to do that? In this case, the USAID office, and that's the United States Agency for International Development, the world's largest dollar value donor, and they were in their Nairobi office thinking, what are we going to do? And they said, we know a lot of enterprises in Kenya that are beginning to sell products and services in the household solar market. What can we do to get more jobs, get more business, get more women doing the installation of those systems, and also spread clean energy in Kenya? And they said, which is a bit unusual, let's put a small amount of money to hiring a firm that can go out and vet, do due diligence on these firms, pick a small set of actors that really could benefit from more investment, and let's pay a transaction advisory firm to go find that investment for them and close investment deals that allows this set of enterprises to grow. And CrossBoundary was a part of this and did just that. And now we're looking at, so in 18 months, 4 deals, 4 investment transactions were closed that brought increased money into these ongoing, proven enterprises in Kenya in this case. And it's delivering on all of these objectives of more jobs, more women employed in those jobs, households now having access to clean energy, solar, they can charge their cell phone, they can run their refrigerator, they can store vaccines, which may be increasingly important as we know. So that's one example. Blending finance, just again, is mixing public and private to get investment flowing faster into the enterprises we care about in the development and for a social and human impact. Let me stop here.
Well, Tunuka, I think we're bouncing right to you, since you've been obviously in the forefront of this initiative that Kristi just outlined, but also obviously you not just in that space, but other activities that your firm is involved in Africa. And I just saw, and I just see Adam, by the way, joining us and saying hello. So Adam Saffer, nice to see you, or at least know that you're here. I think there will be an opportunity to talk a little bit about Nigeria as well, which Adam knows very well. So Tunuka, to you. Please unmute. Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
So tell us your
Thank
firm,
you.
what you're doing about this solar energy, at the sort of household level that Kristi outlined, and other things that your firm is involved in, and how that fits into this larger context of blended finance.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me today. First of all, I hope everyone's doing well and keeping safe and healthy. So I work for CrossBoundary, which is an investment firm. There's largely like 2 sides of the business. So we have an advisory business, which is supporting investors that want to invest in frontier and emerging markets. So not just in Africa, but in any frontier or emerging market. So we do projects in Afghanistan, in Lebanon, in Iraq, as well as all across Africa. And then we have direct investment vehicles, which are focused on solar. So on the advisory side of the business, we work sector agnostic. So as Kristi mentioned, the questions we're trying to answer are for an investor, let's say an American investor that wants to invest in a business in Kenya or in Nigeria or in DRC or in Angola, anywhere on the continent. how do you value a business? How do you assess a business to know that they're investment ready? How much capital can they take? One of the key issues is this information asymmetry. So what will help an investor become more comfortable with making an investment in an emerging market or in a frontier market? On the flip side, we also help entrepreneurs who want to raise capital. And so we'll work with them on building their investment memo, building their financial models, helping them develop the materials that will gain the trust of an investor, but that will start a conversation between them and investors. As you can imagine, if you have an investor sitting in New York or in San Francisco, a business in South Sudan or in Ethiopia is quite far away. And so to start that initial conversation, we as intermediaries act sort of as the middle point between them.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, I'm glad to hear that, in my own personal experience, having worked as an advisor to African governments on investment promotion, it was not really that good at the time, because the best thing that they could do was to open an agency in the Ministry of Trade and say Investment Promotion Center, and hoping that somebody shows up. That was pretty much the way it was done. And they were really disappointed when nobody showed up, and they said, well, come on, we got a one-stop shop. We can help anybody. And I said, yes, but this is not what promotion is. It seems like you're doing the promotion in a good business-like fashion. Noemi, to you, we were talking before beginning our program about gender lens investment and about how you are working in that space. Tell us what this is about and what objectives are you trying to promote?
Thanks, Paolo, and thanks for having me on this panel. So gender lens investing, simply put, is investing with the intent to promote gender equity. So that means investing in women-owned or women-led businesses, investing in enterprises that promote workplace equity, both in staffing, upper management, on boards, and investing in companies that have goods and services that provide a positive good or service to women and girls. So it's really that active desire to ensure that women-owned and led businesses in particular have access to finance, and in particular commercial finance. So moving away from, say, the more informal modes for which women can generally, for small businesses in particular, capitalize their efforts. I oversee our portfolio on Invest, which is funded by the Women's Global Development and Prosperity Initiative, as well as with funding from the Gender Development Office at USAID. The portfolio has about 10 different activities that span the globe. So in Africa, Asia, Latin America, some with global intent. And these activities include establishing innovative funds, so funds that then fund these women-owned, women-led businesses, technical assistance, so ensuring that not just the businesses, but even fund managers and other intermediaries within this chain understand what it means to be gender smart, another way to put it, about how they are using investment funds. And then also helping to learning and move the dial a bit on the barriers, and in particular the policy barriers that impact women's access to finance. So for example, how can we increase women's access to commercial finance by promoting alternative collateral? So moving away from assets such as land and property to what's known as movable property, or that type of asset class that women tend to have more access to, whether it's the products that they have in stock or other means of productions. So those are important ways that help us better understand and promote access to finance for women.
Well, thank you. Kristi, back to you. Can you tell us, again, for those of us obviously who are not as well introduced to this subject, what are the challenges that you as other practitioners, but you've been around this sector now for so many years, what has been the problem in the past about mobilizing private capital in development, and how do you think that what you collectively are doing with others is how is it helping to move the needle in a substantial, hopefully transformative way? I mean, what were the obstacles and how are you intervening in order to remove them?
You know, when you think about these big global donors, and that's everybody from USAID to the United Nations to the European Union, you think, oh my God, they must be on different planets. How are we ever going to make this blending happen? But it's actually not the case, and many of the constraints are addressable. I guess if they weren't addressable, we wouldn't be doing so much work. And many of them are simple things, Paolo. They're operational things. What do I mean by that? Donors are large bureaucracies. They are the government. They manage government resources. So there's a bureaucracy behind that. And that usually determines a certain speed. Then you have the private sector over here, and you have these emerging opportunities to invest. It's kind of like buying a house. They don't stay on the market that long, the good opportunities. So you have to move quickly. So I think one major challenge that we saw was speed to respond. And we made it a principle of rapid response. You've got to, you can't wait a year, you can't even wait 6 months. 3 months is really pushing it. We try to go from start to finish and get these things activated with money in 2 months. So speed is one. You know, there's also language. I've been in many discussions where the private sector and the donor are talking about the same thing, but using different words, and they're just like passing ships. What do I mean by that? You know, many times what we call impact is what a business calls profitability, and there are similarities there. There are other cases where you'll have, you know, a donor talking about primary education, and you'll have a private sector partner talking about job skills. These are the same, you know, they're similar, they're very similar, but we use these terms and then they separate us. So one of the things we also do is we act as interpreters. When Tunuka says intermediary, it's also part of that is a translator back and forth across from government and the donor to the private sector. So one is language, one is speed. I think another constraint is not having the right actors. I work for DAI. We're a very large, you know, we're in the top 5 large USAID implementers for donor projects. But when we need someone to close an investment deal, the traditional implementers are not the ones that have that private sector commercially framed experience. It's firms like CrossBoundary. One of the first things that we did was started to reach out and build what has now become the USAID Finance and Investment Network. It has I think today we reached 340 partners in that network. And if you look at the list of actors and you work in development, you'll probably recognize less than 5% of those names on that list, because they're not, this is the private sector helping the private sector. It's not really development. So I would say those three, getting the right partners to do the work, making sure you move fast enough, and making sure you've got a constant translation going on. Those were 3 huge constraints. That's not rocket science to address those.
But for everybody to understand, please, let me see if I can encapsulate this. Basically, you have government money, right? Your project, you're supporting USAID, which is a donor. And the government money is essentially a catalyst, correct? It's aimed at mobilizing and trying to identify and mobilize, with the help of outside agents and whatnot, opportunities and bring the private sector to the table. And so, if I can use this expression, the public money is a multiplier. I mean, basically, it provides, it's maybe not a lot of money, but it's that critical initial outlay that gives, that creates the appropriate environment, so to speak, for private investors to come in. Is that a good way of saying it? Is that correct?
Yes, mobilize, catalyze, unlock. Let me give you a really quick example, but Noemi and Tunuka have lots of them, and Noemi has some interesting ones in this COVID world as well. So I do want to make sure she jumps in, but let me tell you a quick example. We have the Women's Global Development and Prosperity Initiative is a White House initiative. This is driven by the president, and it's a very high priority. And the objective is to get more investment to women-owned enterprises around the world. Well, how are you going to do that? We selected a fund called Women's World Banking that makes investments in women-owned business. Fabulous fund, well managed, but they needed to replenish the money they had in their fund. They'd used their first tranche, so they were out raising investment for their fund to make more investments. So rather than go just pick a women-owned enterprise and make an investment directly in that, USAID went to the fund, Women's World Banking, and said, how can we help you catalyze this next round? They wanted to raise $100 million. That's what they needed. And USAID gave $500,000. And that is a small amount of money, unlocking, catalyzing, mobilizing $100 million. And they were able then to go around to investors and say, we've got the US government, USAID is a partner in this, they're supporting our fund. And that credibility that came with the US government, small amount of money, has now, I think we're almost ready. We've almost reached, I think the last time I checked, it was at 85 million. So they're almost there, and they've done this fundraise in a less than optimal COVID, pandemic-laced world, and 500,000 raising 100 million. That's okay. Catalytic. That's the small amount of money that was essential. And these ladies have a lot of other examples.
Yeah.
How to do that.
Indeed, Noemi, I understand that you are involved in this project talking about COVID in Italy, right? Which normally would not qualify as a developing country, or maybe it should. I don't know. I was born there, well, for whatever it's worth. But so tell us about this. Is kind of a little bit different, right? Tell us about the dynamics of this and how is it progressing?
Yeah, absolutely. And first, acknowledging what is always the elephant in the room, which is, why are we working in Italy? Because it is not a traditional USAID country, and we're all quite aware of that. Italy is a longstanding ally with the United States, and with COVID, particularly when they were going through the darkest days, the beginning of the year,
yes,
the US was exploring how they could provide support to Italy to combat COVID-19. And one of the mechanisms they have is what Congress, which is known as the Economic Support Funds. So these are emergency funds that can be approved by Congress and then deployed to address a very specific emergent need. And generally speaking, it's funds that are managed by USAID. So it was natural that if support to Italy would go through USAID. Not only that, USAID has the expertise on how to respond to a humanitarian crisis, rather than at an international level, more so than other US agencies. It's what USAID does. So it makes logical sense in terms of why is USAID implementing this program, which in total is about 50 million that is coming from support to Italy. Specifically on Invest, we're managing a $10 million effort to help ramp up production of medical supplies for COVID response. So PPE, therapeutics, medical devices that will help local Italian businesses. And many of them are small businesses. We know this is something that we've learned. You know, they're micro enterprises, family established, maybe 10 people on the, that make up the employee list, and they're scattered throughout the country. You know, some of them might have been in textiles, or others might have been producing medical supplies. But how can they ramp up the production needed based on, you know, what the demand is? What's interesting about that is, you know, what can we learn from Italy? It's what Italy has learned and what we have learned from programs that we're implementing in Africa and Latin America, and that is catalytic capital. If the goal is to help private businesses ramp up supplies, what we also have to be able to do is ramp up investment in these companies. And so we took the model and the examples that we used with WGDP, the Women's Global Development and Prosperity Initiative, of combining catalytic capital, which Kristi's talked about, and technical assistance. Because it's the two things, you know, on the one hand, yes, they need capital, but many of these firms, and this is something that we learned by consulting you know, chambers of commerce, individual firms, and so on, saying, what is it that you need to be able to do this, an operational, organizational, legal, financial, etc., or aside from funding. And many of them said, you know, how can we, you know, we're still trying to understand the changing regulations. We need to better understand how we can secure our supply chains or source more locally, so we're not subject to, for example, supplies that generally came from China or other countries that were cut off because of COVID. So we're working now with 4 partners, and who are raising from this initial investment that USAID has made. About 2 million was going to Catalytic Capital, and they are raising an additional 30 million in debt and equity that will be deployed to at least 20 different companies. And in total, we're providing 55 companies in Italy with technical assistance on how they can ramp up production. Everything from helping them redesign how their manufacturing processes are currently oriented so that they can increase it, or making changes in their production models and processes so that, you know, they can pivot away or pivot towards, if you will, PPE production.
Just to understand this better, Noemi, how did you identify your targets? I mean, how did you end up working with this pool of companies? And you said many of them very small, maybe family-owned enterprises. How did you get to that point that you could operationally get started and
Right.
work with partners? Who found? I suspect you had to have somebody locally to do this for you, right? How did that work?
Absolutely, and that's the other challenge of COVID is in a case like this, we do not have a presence. Neither GAI nor USAID has a presence in Italy because it's not a USAID country. So first off, knowing what is needed, we didn't have that luxury to figure out. So working with US Embassy, you know, we identified and sent out this blast of a request for information with the support of the Chamber of Commerce and other trade associations, to as many companies as we could, and asking them what is the current situation, what are the needs, what are the challenges. And this is how we learned from this pool of, I think, you know, it was probably 200 responses. And this was with a week and a half or a 10-day turnaround. So it was very rapid. Where financing to be able to make these changes, to be able to ramp up production, as well as technical assistance, which surprised us. We just assumed that, you know, this is Italy, or any other country they'll be able to navigate, you know, they know what's going on, when in fact many of them said they're also unclear on how to go about these processes. So with that, we honed in on doing these 2 approaches, which I mentioned, catalytic capital and technical assistance. But again, it's not us as Invest. It's not us sitting in DC or wherever we sit now, saying, okay, we know exactly what to do, who to work with, because we don't. And this is the important role that companies like CrossBoundary or other partners play in being that intermediary. So in this case, we put together a competitive process, a request for proposal for these two approaches. and sent that out again to our partner, to the partner network that Kristi mentioned, but also to a number of firms that the U.S. Embassy and others helped us identify in Italy, because it's important that there's footprint there. You know, the goal was not to have a US-based company do work there. It was really about how can we support not just local companies who are involved in the manufacturing of PPE and other medical supplies, but also those who can provide a technical assistance, our consulting firms, and so on. So,
if I can go even one step further, because to understand really operationally, obviously you have to have somebody who does quality control, right? Because you got all this big network mobilized, and inevitably something goes wrong at some point. You know, I'm not saying it has to go, but it often does. So who is there checking that the trains run on time, that everything is done well, or if there is a problem that is immediately known and identified, and something is done to address it? Operationally, who does that?
So our 4 partners all have boots on the ground, if you will. So I'll name one, Cucci & Partners. They're a consulting firm. They've been around for a long time. They're providing technical assistance to, I think they're around 30 companies. No,
so that's your lead company, your lead partner.
That's one. Well, we have 4. We have 4 companies. So 2 are specifically providing technical assistance, and the other 2 are doing catalytic capital, and one of those is also providing technical assistance. So they have their subcontracts. They have their very clear deliverables of what they have to deliver to us, whether it's a capital raise or providing assistance to X number of countries, and they have very clear indicators of how they're going to demonstrate that. So if they're saying they're raising capital, there has to be demonstration that there are letters of commitment coming from investors. With the technical assistance, they have to demonstrate to us how did they choose these companies, what criteria. And our team, so we have a team of 3 of us who are overseeing this portfolio. In addition to that, our monitoring and evaluation team, the communications team support this, develop those frameworks of how we're going to measure these results, and whether they've actually achieved it. So it is on them to deliver, and this subcontract is managed by us, but there are different checkpoints. In addition to hitting these targets, there's the bi-weekly check-ins. We also have, we happen to have a DAI staff colleague who is based in Italy. And so she's someone who can work directly with companies as needed. The US Embassy now has a USAID point person on the ground who serves as that liaison to the mission for USAID. But, in this remote world, first there is trust. We brought on these companies because we trust them. They do good work. We did our due diligence that they are competent and they will deliver. And they then select who they will work with based on objective criteria that we vet. So it's not, so we ensure that how they select who gets investment or who receives technical assistance, there's metrics in place that help them make that selection, and that we're clear of, and we can show to anybody to say these are the criteria that were used to do so.
Well, that's remarkable. Tunuka, back to you. Give us a little bit of a flavor of more of the things that you are doing, you and your colleagues, I guess. I mean, you're based in East Africa, but you cover the continent, I imagine, right? And also I see here a question from Adam, who said, who takes first loss? In other words, how, if things go south, who's absorbing the hit? But that's kind of, you can illustrate that as you talk about some examples of the things you're doing, whether it's about this solar thing in Kenya or anything else you care to illustrate.
So yeah, I think to start with the solar, so CrossBoundary Energy, we have a direct investment platform. It's a solar fund for commercial industrial solar, so that finances commercial industrial solar. So essentially USAID, similar to the what Kristi explained with Women's World Banking, USAID provided the first loss and sort of gave the confidence for other investors to invest, because this was the first vehicle on the continent that was financing commercial industrial solar. Investors were a bit cautious about investing in this fund. And as I'm sure you know, first-time funds always have trouble raising capital. So first, USAID provided the first loss, and then a number of family offices came in. The first fund was quite small and recently exited the fund. There was a 15% IRR. So for comparison, normally an infrastructure fund would have 5% IRR. So this is well exceeded expectations. If it had gone south, USAID would have taken the first loss. It didn't, and so the money was returned to the investors, and then for USAID to reinvest in other projects. They exited this year and raised a second fund, a $40 million financing facility for commercial industrial solar. We also do have a mini-grid facility, so more working on mini-grids and financing for rural residential like homes, families, etc. I think another good example, just more on the advisory side of the business. So I was thinking of two examples in particular. One was in Nigeria, a business called Tomato Joss, where there was an investor who was interested in investing in the business, but wasn't sure how to value the business. So USAID essentially subsidized our fees because the ticket size was quite small. So they only wanted to invest a couple $1 million. For a deal that's that small, there's the same amount of work has to be done as a $50 million, $100 million deal, which means that budgets can be quite tight. So USAID essentially subsidized our fees so that we could go in, do the valuation, evaluate the business from the investor's perspective, and it ultimately led to a successful investment. This is not always the case. Sometimes I think normally a deal in a frontier or emerging market can take up to 24 months. The deals that we've worked on take about 12 months on average, anywhere between 6 and 18 months. Another deal that we worked on that closed recently in COVID was for an investor that wanted to expand a business that they had previously invested in Tanzania. It's an asset financing business. So they essentially give loans to farmers for farming equipment. And they wanted to expand that platform into Kenya. And so a couple months ago, they announced a $12 million investment to expand this platform in Kenya, which is quite important given this year in Kenya, we had the locust infestation, there's been flooding and drought and COVID and a number of other things. This will provide another financing option for a lot of farmers, smallholder farmers, many of whom are women. So it was quite exciting. I know $12 million sounds quite small, especially in the American context, but in Kenya, that's a pretty big deal and will create a lot of opportunities for Kenyan farmers.
If I may ask something else, talking about the general conditions for doing business. Obviously, you're there, you're providing advisory services, right, to investors. But then there is, what is called the investment climate and the difficulties, which vary a great deal from country to country. But in terms of actually navigating this system, the bureaucracy, everything. I've worked, in various projects, including working on improving the business climate in Ethiopia 3-4 years ago. And one of the gems of Ethiopia, if I can name one, is that every company had to re-register every year. How'd you like that? That's really useful, right? It provides value for everybody, and they had to provide everything. The articles of incorporations, who are the directors, all their audited taxes, everything had to be done in the original, and all the fees had to be paid in cash. How's that for something that is really business friendly? And when I saw that, I thought, I said, I tried to convince them that perhaps this was not particularly useful, and we got into very complicated discussions. But that's just one example of things that I've seen on the ground. So, and I know many of these things obviously are completely beyond your power to modify, but how do you navigate? How do you help your clients, so to speak, navigate what can be sometimes a very complicated, bureaucratic, fiscal, regulatory, or environmental, very often just inefficiency, just difficulties to get things done? I know it's a huge question, but you must have some method.
No, absolutely. That's a great question. I think the first part of my answer is going to sound really too simple, but half of my job is, having teams, or half of the reason CrossBoundary has been so successful is having teams on the ground from those countries that understand the systems, that understand how things work. I was born and raised in Kenya. My whole team is Kenyan. And similarly, we have people on the ground in Addis. I think, for an investor in DC, in London, in New York, in San Francisco, anywhere else, a lot of times, they don't even know what they don't know because they haven't, or they're not on the ground. And even when they are on the ground, they don't understand how the systems work. So that, I think, is often step one. Step two then is working with, for example, IFC advisory. They work, their primary client are governments, and they work with governments on sort of removing the red tape, or not removing the red tape, but creating better infrastructure for investment. So working, for example, on like doing business indicators and things like that, on business registries, on taxation. How do you set up a proper taxation system? Things of that nature. And so we often do work with firms like that. Where they will ask us, okay, you work with a number of different investors. What are the key challenges that investors have come upon? And how can we work with governments to overcome that? In every country it's different, but by and large, if you do look across all countries, there are very similar themes, like you're saying, business registration, taxation, corruption, these types of things. And having people on the ground can definitely help investors, particularly investors who aren't located on the ground, navigate these to some extent. But it's not easy, right? It's not easy in the US or anywhere else either, right? But the more you know the system, the easier it can be.
Well, Kristi, let me bounce this to you. Again, I don't know if you have anything to add to what Tunuka just said. Obviously, you're looking at the very, very large picture, overseeing so many different projects in so many different parts of the world. How do you see this as a real impediment, or is it something you can live with and still make things happen and continue in your effort of catalyzing government money with private investors and telling investors, okay, yeah, it may be complicated, but it's not so bad. I mean, we'll help you and you'll do fine. I mean, how does it work operationally, day to day?
Yeah, Paolo, we're in 64 countries right now. And you heard Tunuka say a lot of, we have this, I would say there's a bias toward transactions and also that catalytic capital of helping funds attract investment dollars. So either going into a fund or going into an enterprise. There's definitely, we are working on that transaction bias, but one of the things I've seen, and I know USAID values this as well, these transactions in carrying them out, and we are able to carry them out. We have a pipeline of deals to close that's way over $1 billion right now. So there's, in the next year and a half to 2 years, there's a lot of transactions that will be closed in a very imperfect investment climate. And how is that so, and what does that do? Well, it's amazing that these deals can close in countries that do have a lot of investment obstacles. One of the things we've seen though, so in Haiti, like in Italy, we awarded intentionally local firms. And we did that so that we could start to really catalyze a market for these kind of services that a firm like CrossBoundary provide all over the world. Haiti and USAID in Haiti believe that if we got the local actors doing this, and they're very, very small, forget 1 to 2 million. We had, I think, a debt investment of $20,000, tractors or something. So these were small, but what they did was they illuminated the constraints in the investment ecosystem. And then USAID is able to come with its other programs, the US Embassy, the Ambassador, and they're carrying on these dialogues, and they're pushing the government, as is to be expected, on we need to fix this. This is a huge constraint. We're seeing this is an impediment. Meanwhile, these deals and these transactions, we're closing them and they're continuing to shine a spotlight on those constraints with it, which are then picked up and elevated in the US government dialogue at a higher level with government. So that's one of the ways it works. And I consider that the longer term byproduct. We're not meant to go in and plod on a capacity building program around, or a regulatory reform program around investment climate. We're supposed to get these transactions done, get these funds energized with more capital, and that is supposed to eliminate the problems, and it does.
All right.
Fingers crossed they'll be addressed.
We got some questions from our audience that I would like to put back to you. One is, I guess about Italy. Somebody is asking, hey, we're helping companies do business in Italy. What about us? We have domestic, unanswered domestic issues with companies shutting down and going bankrupt left and right. Is that a good allocation of resources? Essentially, I guess this would be regarding the Italian project you're running, Noemi. Is that a fair criticism?
I mean, I don't disagree that there needs to be support for U.S. businesses during COVID times. I think if we take that back at the broader level, it also should not be a zero-sum game in terms of there should be support as needed in the United States. And the U.S. has always supported developing countries and allies around the world. So, that's something that, yes, it's, there's moments, and believe, we feel this ourselves, like, why there? Why not elsewhere? But it is what we were asked to do, and we will do it to the best of our ability. But again, it's that I don't think that the United States, with its economic powers, it needs to close borders and say we're only going to focus on this. We've always been generally a country that looks to the world and looks to support around the world.
I just want to add to that COVID is a borderless problem here. So actually, we all remember when Italy's numbers were really, really high. And then when they started tracking an Italian tourist in Canada, Italian tourist in, they're spreading COVID. So it's not like helping Italy keep its COVID numbers down doesn't have any impact. But I would say a bigger motivation in all of this is we are an interconnected economy. This is a global economy. COVID has shown this also. 3 out of 5 of the jobs in the United States have some connection to the economies outside of the United States. We buy products, we sell products. Italy is a trading partner with the United States as well. Italy also trades with Africa. And so if we're trying to help Africa and Italy as a trading partner, if we really get PPE production up in Italy, I fully expect to see Italian masks in Somalia, okay? So, and perhaps in the United States. I just don't think we should be drawing these lines like that. So we're all interconnected. Helping Italy helps us. Helping Italy control its COVID helps us control our COVID, so.
Well, somebody else was asking, but Tunuka, I see you've handled it in a chat about the solar program. Do you want to add something about the scaling of that, or making it work across boundaries?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and write my email in the chat, and then you can email me and I can send you a couple articles about it. So, and also just for clarity, there are some Chinese walls between advisory and CBE, and so I can maybe put you in touch with someone on CBE. But I did actually want to answer the second question from Clarence, which I find super important and fascinating, because this is something we've thought a lot about this year, about how, is this sustainable, you know, with a pending economic downturn? And I think one thing that we've kind of seen is that diversification, or that, you know, diversification in an investment portfolio is necessary, and one way to diversify is geographically. And so regardless of whether or not, I do think, you know, countries in general will be focusing inwards, you know, and will want to deploy capital internally, and you already see that in Europe, etc. But ultimately, for in order to get the returns, let's say like a pension fund or something, you see now more U.S. pension funds, for example, Chicago Teachers has investments across Africa, etc., deploying capital in Africa because it helps diversify the portfolio, thereby improving like returns in the long term. So I don't actually think it will have a large effect, particularly because emerging markets are quite resilient. And as you've seen, I think the economic effects of COVID, depending on how you look at it, the economic effects have been greater in Western countries than they have, or in global North countries than global South countries, because global South countries, and I can speak from Kenya, you know, COVID was one of 10 things we were dealing with this year. Like I said before, we had locusts, we had drought, we had flooding, and so in many ways, businesses here are built to be more resilient than they are in other parts of the world. And so I don't think it's, I actually think many businesses elsewhere will look to emerging markets in certain times in terms of like, what are the tenets of building a really resilient business? But yeah, I'll let someone else respond to that as well, because it's a really interesting.
Again, somewhat related to what you're doing there in East Africa, there's a question about other, you know, obviously you're focusing on solar at the sort of household level. It seems to me, you know, try to provide assistance to those who want to improve their basic conditions by purchasing or deploying, whatever the word is, you know, a solar system at a household or village level. And the question is, what about other solutions? Are you just focusing on solar or other types of alternative energy or renewable energy? Is your portfolio mixed and varied, or are you specialized in a particular technological solution?
So our direct investment vehicles focus specifically on solar. On the advisory side of the business, it's much more diverse, right? Because we can advise on deals sector agnostic, and so we do look at deals in health and in agriculture, etc. But in the direct investment platforms, it's just solar for now. Okay,
fair enough. And then we have a broader question here. This is a philosophical one, asking, well, okay, you're doing this, you're trying to, as you were saying, Kristi, you know, identify and promote transactions. But what about all the good old-fashioned traditional objectives of development, social justice, equity, democratization? Do the two intersect? I suspect they do, but maybe I'll leave it to you to explain how promoting transactions and investments further the traditional objectives of development. Kristi.
Yeah, you know, poverty, which is the biggest challenge that we face in development, and poverty drives a whole host of other problems. Governance is connected to poverty, health is connected to poverty, education. So if you are going to tackle poverty and try to alleviate it, I'm sorry, no amount of donor money in the world is going to do this through well-intentioned grants. That's not how it works. It works, and I remember very distinctly when I was working in Africa, and it was in the height of the AIDS crisis, and we went to Botswana, and every single community we went to said, I don't care about the medicine, HIV, I know you're trying to save my life. I want a job. I need an income. I'm sick. I need to be productive and make money and take care of my family for as long as I can. Inside that comment is a key to, I think, addressing poverty or HIV AIDS or whatever, and that is that giving people respectful ways to have productive life and a livelihood. So generating jobs and income, which we do through small businesses, which we do through enterprises. Yes, I grew up, we were self-employed farmers, if you will, but that's also a business today. So for me, generating investment carries this back to businesses which employ people and poor people and women, and with that money they send their kids to school, they get health care, they have savings, they improve their lives. So all of this circle, I do believe very strongly that getting investment and helping enable growth in businesses, just like it did in our country, on the backs of small and medium enterprises, it's absolutely essential to do if you want to tackle these conundrum social problems of poverty and poor governance. The oil companies have seen, they've studied this in the Niger Delta, and I'm sure Adam Safford knows this, that poor governance, one way to address is not just throw grants at it, but is to get an economy going and get people invested in stability because of that reason. So I'll stop there. I could go on and on.
Okay. But again, this leads me, Noemi, back to you. I'm really intrigued by your project in Italy. And that makes me think, and I don't know if this is just an idle thought and a dream, but scale it up. In other words, not just about Italy and the production of the COVID, implements whatever is necessary to fight the pandemic, but it seems like this is remarkably successful, what you're describing, and it seems to me something that could be looked at for other situations in addressing other needs in other countries. Of course, right now we all focus on the pandemic, as we should, until the vaccines will deliver us from evil. But that's going to be a while. But I mean, there can be other issues in other sectors where the same model that you seem to have developed regarding Italy could be applicable, and again, to the traditional targets of development, but to others that are not so traditional, other, I don't know, transitional economies, whether they are in the Balkans or in Central Asia or Latin America or whatever, that maybe these days are not very high on the radar. So it seems to me you're onto something here. I mean, again, I don't want to anticipate the outcomes of a project which is still, on its way, but it seems to be, what are your thoughts based on your experience so far? Is this scalable? Noemi.
Absolutely. And I'll say that all of the partners we're working with in Italy have never worked with donor funding before. So to them, that's, and they are already in discussion amongst each other, how can we do this for another sector in Italy, because they're Italian firms, or how can we do this in Europe? And they're already talking to other potential European donors about how we can leverage and catalyze funding for initiatives or for these challenges, whether they're in health or education. There's, I think, a lot of companies, and this is a blending that I see happening, is that people, companies, development sector, private sector, governments want to do good. It's no longer just in the camp of development now. And I think that's one thing that, while we're talking about investment is one facet of it, but it's investment also coupled with the more traditional programs of looking at education, of looking at health, of looking at governance. But I agree that the scaling is important. USAID definitely is looking at that. But I think the sustainability of these approaches also lies with the partners that we have who live beyond us. We're a project that has a life, and a very defined life. They will continue on.
And it seems to me, Tunuka, that you probably, obviously you're in a different environment, but you probably find, I guess, similar situations. And I've been personally impressed in meeting many Africans and people, with ideas, young entrepreneurs, people who now have a kind of a more up to it sort of, modern education, and they want to do this and they want to do that. But very often they don't know, they lack the tools, right? they don't know how to set up a business. They don't know how to do all their due diligence. And so they may have a great idea, a great concept, which doesn't develop because they don't have the instruments. And it seems to me that this is probably a parallel with what has been experienced in Italy, where you may have these small firms in which people can do this and that, but they just don't know how to get themselves organized as a going concern. So is that a space? I mean, are we getting into planetary consulting here? Can we do this? I mean, I'm just, I like to throw big ideas, but you think this is doable? Is this in other words, is this the future of development? If I may throw this at you.
Well, okay, so that's a tough question to answer, but I do think it's definitely showing results right now, right? I do think sometimes things come in waves, and maybe this is just a wave. But at the same time, I think Noemi made a great point about that. Now people are trying to work together, and everyone's trying to come together to, reach a better solution. We have more information than we've ever had before. We have more people, connecting and seeing the issues and seeing how, their part in the issues, and seeing, different and new and innovative solutions. I do think there's been a tremendous amount of traction behind this, and I am hopeful that it will create a lot of meaningful change in the next couple years. But I mean, I don't know what we'll be talking about in 50 years from now, to be honest.
All right. Well, I mean, this is a good note. And it seems to me that if the United States government becomes the promoter of innovation and best practices in the private sector, I think we've achieved some kind of a miracle here. So I think USAID Invest, it seems to me like, I don't know, something to continue to look at. And again, I think we've reached now the end of our time. And I would really like to thank all of you. This has been a great discussion. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Kristi, for putting this panel together. Thank all of you. Thank you, Noemi. Thank you, Tunuka. And thank to my good friend and colleague, Denise, for organizing the event. And with that, on behalf of the Global Policy Institute and Bay Atlantic University, I wish you goodbye, and we stand adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.